The Natalee Holloway mystery was finally solved, and the truth is horrifying. A teenage girl checks into a hotel room in Aruba with her senior class, laughing with her friends, celebrating the end of high school. 18 years later, in a courtroom more than 2,000 miles away, the man responsible for her disappearance finally says out loud what happened to her. Between those two moments sits one of the most obsessively followed missing person cases in American history, and a second young woman who paid the price for a justice system that let a killer walk free. This is the story of what really happened to Natalee Holloway and why the answer, when it finally came, was almost worse than the silence. Natalee and Holloway grew up in Mountain Brook, an upscale suburb just outside Birmingham, Alabama. Friends and teachers remembered her as sharp, sociable, and driven. She had graduated with honors, she danced competitively, and she was set to begin pre-med studies at the University of Alabama that fall with an eye toward a career in medicine. She was close with her mother, Beth Twitty, and by every account had the kind of steady, hopeful life that made what came next feel almost impossible to believe. In late May of 2005, Natalee joined more than 100 of her classmates on a graduation trip to Aruba, a small Dutch Caribbean island prized for its calm turquoise water and its reputation as one of the safer tourist destinations in the region. The group stayed along Palm Beach at a resort strip filled with restaurants, casinos, and nightclubs. For most of the week, the trip unfolded exactly as expected: sun, beaches, and teenagers enjoying a last taste of freedom before college began. On the final night before the group was scheduled to fly home, several students went out to a nightclub in the capital, Oranjestad. Natalee was among them. At some point during the evening, she struck up a conversation with a young man named Joran van der Sloot, an 18-year-old who had grown up on the island and was well known in local social circles. He was with two brothers, Deepak and Satish Kalpo. Witnesses recalled Natalee spending much of the night with the three of them, seemingly at ease. As the club emptied out in the early hours of the morning, she told friends not to worry. She had a ride back to the hotel. She was seen getting into a car with the three young men. No one from her group ever saw her again. The next morning was checkout day. When Natalee's roommates went to gather their things, they found her bed untouched, her suitcase packed and waiting, her passport still in the room. She was simply gone. What began as confusion turned quickly into alarm as the hours passed with no word and no answer on her phone. Most of the traveling students had no choice but to board their scheduled flight home, but a small group of Natalee's closest friends and several chaperones stayed behind, unwilling to leave the island without her. Within a day, Beth Holloway had flown to Aruba herself, beginning a search that would consume years of her life. Investigators quickly focused on the three young men Natalee had last been seen with. Van der Sloot and the Kalpo brothers initially claimed they had driven her around the island, stopped near a lighthouse, and then dropped her back at her hotel sometime after 2 a.m, saying she had walked inside on her own. It was a plausible enough story on its face, until investigators checked it against the hotel's own records. Security cameras covering the entrances showed no sign of Natalee returning that night. Her electronic key card had not been used again after she left for the club. No staff member on the overnight shift recalled seeing her. The account the three men gave simply did not match the physical evidence, and from that contradiction, the case turned from a missing persons search into a criminal investigation. Van der Sloot and the Kalpo brothers were arrested in early June 2005, along with several other people connected to the case, as investigators tried to piece together what had actually happened that night. But Aruban law placed strict limits on how long suspects could be held without formal charges, and formal charges required physical evidence, a body, forensic material, something beyond a story that had fallen apart. Investigators didn't have it. Van der Sloot's account of the night shifted repeatedly under questioning, one version replacing another, but shifting stories, however suspicious, were not enough to sustain a prosecution. After roughly 10 days, all three men were released. What followed was one of the most extensive search efforts ever conducted for a missing person. Aruban police worked alongside Dutch investigators and the FBI, combing beaches, coastal caves, and the island's rugged limestone interior. Search teams and volunteer organizations, including groups with experience finding remains in difficult terrain, walked grid patterns for months. Divers checked reefs and drop-offs. Sonar equipment swept the coastal waters. Tips poured in from psychics, anonymous callers, and amateur sleuths captivated by the case. Nearly all of it led nowhere. Aruba's coastline is shaped by strong, unpredictable currents capable of carrying anything out to sea within hours, and its interior is riddled with sinkholes and caverns that don't give up what falls into them easily. Search after search turned up nothing, and the story became, in a strange way, defined by everywhere Natalee wasn't. Meanwhile, the case became a fixture of American cable news in a way few missing person stories ever had. Natalee's graduation photo appeared nightly on broadcasts across the country. Reporters camped outside the courthouse in Aruba. Beth Holloway became a constant, composed presence on television, refusing to let her daughter's disappearance fade from public attention. And Joran van der Sloot, rather than retreating from the spotlight, seemed at times to court it, giving interviews and sitting for on-camera confrontations, his account of that night changing yet again with each retelling. In late 2007, it looked as though a breakthrough had finally arrived. A hidden recording surfaced in which van der Sloot appeared to describe what had happened to Natalee, seemingly admitting she had died that night and describing disposing of her remains. New arrests followed. For a moment, the case seemed close to resolution. But once confronted with the tape, van der Sloot claimed he had fabricated the entire account to impress the person he was speaking to, that none of it was true. With no body and no corroborating evidence, the recording alone couldn't support new charges, and once again, he was released. The years that followed brought no resolution. Searches wound down. Media attention thinned. And in 2012, at the request of Natalee's family, a court formally declared her legally dead, a procedural step that offered no answers but forced an unbearable kind of finality. There was still no body, no conviction, no confirmed account of what had actually happened. Only an absence, and a family that refused to stop asking. What almost no one outside the investigation understood at the time was that the danger van der Sloot posed had not ended with his release. 5 years to the day after Natalee Holloway vanished, May 30th, 2010, he was in Lima, Peru, where he met a 21-year-old business student named Stephanie Flores Ramirez at a poker tournament. Stephanie came from a prominent, well-regarded family in Lima and was, like Natalee, a young woman with a future ahead of her. The two left together and went back to his hotel room. Hallway security cameras later captured van der Sloot leaving alone, moving quickly and appearing agitated. When hotel staff entered the room, they found Stephanie dead. Van der Sloot fled Peru almost immediately, crossing into Chile, where he was arrested days later, while apparently attempting to continue on to Argentina. This time, unlike in Aruba, investigators had exactly what had been missing 5 years earlier: a body, a crime scene, physical and video evidence connecting him directly to the killing. He was extradited back to Peru, and in January 2012 he was convicted of Stephanie Flores's murder and sentenced to 28 years in prison, along with financial restitution to her family. The date is the detail that makes this part of the story almost impossible to sit with. Not 5 years later in a general sense, 5 years to the exact calendar day. A young man who had been questioned, arrested, and released for lack of evidence in 2005 was free long enough to take another life on the anniversary of the first. It stands as one of the clearest, most painful illustrations of what happens when a dangerous person slips through the gaps in a justice system that, for all its careful rules, could not hold him without proof it never managed to secure. There is one more layer to this story, and it may be the cruelest. Shortly before he killed Stephanie Flores, van der Sloot had approached people close to Beth Holloway with an offer. For a substantial sum of money, he claimed he would reveal where Natalee's remains could be found. An arrangement was made, reportedly with law enforcement involvement, and a partial payment changed hands. The coordinates he ultimately provided led nowhere. It wasn't information. It was extortion, a lie sold to a grieving mother for money, and because the victims were American citizens, it also constituted a federal crime that United States prosecutors could pursue regardless of what had or hadn't happened in Aruba years earlier. That extortion charge, filed and waiting on paper for years while van der Sloot served his sentence in Peru, became the mechanism that finally forced accountability. In June 2023, he was temporarily extradited to the United States to face charges of extortion and wire fraud tied to that scheme. And in October 2023, in a federal courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama, less than an hour from where Natalee had grown up, he entered into a plea agreement. As part of that deal, Joran van der Sloot finally admitted, in his own words, that he had killed Natalee Holloway on the beach that night in 2005, and he provided investigators with an account of what happened to her remains afterward. Prosecutors treated the admission as credible, consistent with the physical evidence gathered from the hotel and the surrounding area nearly 2 decades earlier. Outside the courthouse, Beth Holloway spoke to reporters, saying plainly what she had waited 18 years to be able to say. He was no longer just a suspect. He was the confirmed killer of her daughter. But even this resolution arrives wrapped in hard, uncomfortable truths. Natalee's remains have never been recovered. Because the admission came through a plea agreement tied to the extortion and fraud case rather than a full murder trial, van der Sloot was never formally tried or convicted for Natalee's killing itself. And the confession, however consistent with the evidence, came from a man with an 18-year record of lying, to investigators on secret recordings, and to a mother he extorted for money. The truth arrived without a body, without a murder conviction, spoken by someone whose word had been worthless for nearly 2 decades. That is the strange, imperfect shape that closure took after all those years. What should sit with anyone hearing this story isn't just the final confession. It's the 5 years in between. A young man was questioned by investigators from 3 different countries, arrested, studied, and ultimately released because the evidence available at the time wasn't enough to charge him. And precisely 5 years later, a 21-year-old woman in Lima was dead. That failure wasn't abstract. It had a name, a family, and a future that ended in a hotel room thousands of miles from where the pattern first began. So remember them both, not as headlines but as who they actually were. Natalee Holloway, 18 years old, an honor student with a place waiting for her at the University of Alabama, on a trip meant to celebrate everything ahead of her. Stephanie Flores Ramirez, 21, a business student with her own ambitions and a family that loved her just as fiercely. And remember Beth Holloway, who spent 18 years refusing to let her daughter's name disappear from public memory, long after the cameras stopped showing up and the searches were called off. The truth in this case didn't come from a diver, a search dog, or a sonar sweep of the coastline. It came, finally, from the one place no one expected, the mouth of the man who had spent nearly 2 decades denying it. And it's worth asking, honestly, whether it would have come at all if he hadn't first been forced to answer for the crime that took Stephanie's life. If the evidence in 2005 had been just a little stronger, if the case in Aruba had never slipped away in those first 10 days, is there a version of the story where Stephanie Flores is still alive today? That's a question without a comfortable answer, but it's one worth sitting with. And if you have thoughts on it, say so in the comments below.